Good morning. As we celebrate the birth of Christ, God's Son, I will be reading from John 1, verses 1 through 14. Hear what God says to us, the church. John 1, 1 through 14, appearing on page 91 of the New Testament. The Word was first, the Word present to God, God present to the world. The Word was God, in readiness for God from day one. Everything was created through him. Nothing, not one thing, came into being without him. What came into existence was life, and the life was light to live by. The life light blazed out of the darkness couldn't put it out. There once was a man, his name John, sent by God to point out the way to the light. He came to show everyone where to look, who to believe in. John was not himself the light. He was there to show the way to the light. The light was the real thing. Every person entering life he brings into light. He was in the world. The world was there through him, and yet the world didn't even notice. He came to his own people, but they didn't want him. But whoever did want him, who believed he was who he claimed and would do what he said, he made their true selves, their child of God selves. These are the God-begotten, not blood together. Not flesh begotten, not sex begotten. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. This is the word of the Lord.
I'm just going to move a little closer to you. Well, it was in my third year of ministry, still pretty wet behind the ears, that I suggested to the elders in our pastoral charge, which was in Prince Edward Island, that maybe our late communion service on Christmas Eve we should have in a barn. Next year at St. Andrews? I thought, being on Prince Edward Island, it shouldn't be too hard to find a barn someplace. And it wasn't. Robert Miller said, "You can have mine." And his grandson spent all of Christmas Eve clearing out 1/4 of the barn for us. And so he scooped manure and cleaned everything up and then put down fresh hay in that 1/4 of the barn. And the cows were in the other 3/4 of the barn. Now, have you been in a barn with animals before? Do you know how noisy it is? Yeah. So animals, well, you can imagine all the things that they're doing. Yes, mooing and peeing and et cetera, et cetera. And it's amazing how loud all of that is. But the thing that was interesting was I said to people in advance, I said, remember, it's winter and it's a barn, so dress accordingly. And so as the space filled up, which it did, there was more people came to that service than we had ever seen at a Christmas Eve service. And as they came in, I saw women in high heels and fur coats and men in Italian designer suits making their way through the cobwebs and the muck. It seems impossible, I think, for us to accept that the Lord of the universe coming into our midst came in a barn and came as a helpless baby, born really in very unfortunate circumstances where poverty and neediness were everywhere, right? Did we get this in the story? These were parents who didn't even have a place. You know, even this barn was offered to them. They had nothing. Nothing. Now, we may be able to kind of, have a lovely olive wood carved set to make it look nice. And we may try to cover it over with sentimentality and romanticism, but it was a mess, really. It was a mess. Well, let's think about this morning. We have the perfect opportunity to think of God as a baby. Now, have you thought about what that really looks like? Why? Why would God not just sort of descend from heaven in a grand entrance? Why would God come as a baby with such neediness? We all know how much need babies have. They have to be cared for, right? Right. Well, Henry Nouwen offers us an answer to this. And he said, from the beginning of creation, God says to humanity, I love you with an everlasting love. And Jesus, the Word made flesh, comes to be able to tell us that exact thing. God saying, I love you with an everlasting love. Actually, this whole thing is life-changing. If we can let this sink into us, it changes the whole way we live. That we know that we are loved by God no matter what. We can make some rotten mistakes sometimes, right? But that does not keep God from loving us. That's the kind of love that we're talking about here. There is no mistake that will not be forgiven. If God's love is so faithful and true, it means that these years that we spend on earth here are really our chance to answer God and say, yes, I love you too. So Amelia is going to help me preach part of this sermon this morning. We'll see how we get along. Hi. Good morning. Hi. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay, we'll see whether we need this. Hi. Okay. So let's think of Jesus, the newborn baby. Okay? Let's think about that. Needing to be breastfed, needing to be changed, needing to be taught, needing a mom and dad to help him grow, right? Think of the neediness. In this baby Jesus, God is saying, I want to be weak so that you can love me. What better way to help you to respond to my love than by becoming weak and vulnerable myself so that you can then care for me? Think about that. God becomes weak. God becomes a stumbling God who falls at the cross, who dies for us, and who is totally in need of love. Why? God does this so that God can be close to us. Right? This close. The God who loves us is a God who becomes weak and vulnerable and dependent in a manger and dependent on a cross. So one of the things that we noticed in that barn in PEI was that being in the barn that night attracted a different element. We saw people in church that night, or in the barn, who never came to church. There were even some sketchy people that showed up because they felt they could, because it was a barn, not our lovely, upright, and beautiful sanctuary put together, but because it was a barn. There's something about that humbleness, that humility, that opens up relationship, isn't it? Right? Don't we see it again and again, that when we are in fact made vulnerable and weak, that we become more open to the other, right? Different people have mentioned to me since I came to Calgary how that happened during the floods, the flood a few years ago, right? People who normally would have been very well put together and in control suddenly needed other people to help them. And people showed up from other parts of the city and the province, and they showed up at people's doors, and relationships were fostered that never were fostered before. Okay, you're going to put me to the test. Want to try this? I may be a little out of practice, but okay. We human beings tend to balk at being vulnerable and weak. You know, we don't like it when we're sick and we have to ask someone to do something for us. We don't like being at the mercy of others, do we? We fight to be independent as long as we can. We resist the vulnerability and weakness of aging and allowing others to do more for us, or the vulnerability of being ill, or the vulnerability of loss and pain, and our need of someone else to help us, or to support us, or comfort us. We resist that vulnerability that's required when we have to reach across a chasm of conflict to be the first one to say, I'm sorry, we can work this out. But our faithful God shows us the way of being vulnerable and opening ourselves to deeper relationship, not only with God, but each other. And God shows us in this scandalous act where God condescends to us, as Luther says, and talks baby talk to us. Some may try to make God into some powerful, aloof, and even angry, judgmental deity. But in Jesus, God gives us a new definition of God. A God who wants to be close to us. A God who is willing to be vulnerable and humble, willing to be weak. In Jesus, we see that kind of weak and vulnerable love not only leads to the wounds of the cross, but ultimately to the new life of the resurrection. The incarnation of Jesus has come out to us. God has come out to us to say to us that we might always remember, I love you with an everlasting love. And today Jesus gives us the chance to say with deepest conviction, yes, God, and I love you too. Amen. I think we should preach a sermon together again.